The Nike Streakfly has been out for about 15 months now, and now is about the time that we should start to see Streakfly 2 prototypes pop up on Nike athletes' feet. Now, the Streakfly leaked on social media for well over a year, and we always saw it on track athletes' feet. So, keep an eye on your favorite Nike sponsored track athlete, and you may just see a Streakfly 2 prototype fairly soon. Overall, I think the Streakfly has been a fairly successful shoe for Nike. I don't think it's been what they expected it to be. I don't necessarily think it's been a very good race shoe for them, but I think a lot of different types of athletes have picked up the Streakfly as something that's very integral into their training. So it's become a very important training shoe for road runners like myself, who love it for some easy runs, some daily training, and a lot of speed work and interval work, especially hill reps. I think some track athletes and cross-country athletes are also using this shoe as a workout shoe, maybe when they don't want to spike up, or even California cross-country type courses where you're on smooth packed dirt, maybe some asphalt, maybe a tiny bit of grass, and it works well for all of those ranges. So there's enough success with the Streakfly that we will definitely see a Streakfly 2. But the question is, what will the Streakfly be and when will it come? Now, the Streakfly shares a lineage with the Streak series from Nike. I talk about that a lot in my first video about the Streakfly, card on the screen, link in the description. But the Streak was Nike's road racing flat platform before the super shoe era. And they updated it sort of when they felt they needed to. It wasn't regular clockwork like, say, the Nike Pegasus, where we know every year we'll get a new peg. It was whenever Nike needed to update it. So some years or some versions you'd see 12 to 13 months, others would be 20 months. So it was really when Nike needed to update something, not on a yearly cycle. And I think the Streakfly is going to follow that same paradigm. And like I said, I do definitely think we're going to see a Streakfly 2, but the big question is, what will the Streakfly 2 actually be? Now, it could be just an upper refresh, and same midsole, same outsole. And honestly, I would be kind of totally okay with that because I love the Streakfly because of that midsole. Part of me doesn't want them to change it, but I do think Nike will evolve the Streakfly. Because again, I don't think it hit the mark as far as a 5 to 10K race shoe, but I think it's been a great training shoe. And it'll be interesting to see where Nike wants to position it moving forward. I do think it's always going to be a bit more of a race shoe for Nike. Therefore, I do think they're going to need to push the shoe a little bit beyond what it is right now. The first thing I think Nike's going to have to address is this upper. Now, overall, I think this upper has been very good. I'm very happy with it, but I know it's not perfect. I know it has a little bit too much volume in it, and I know the fit is not necessarily really a race fit, because it's got a lot of volume in it. I don't think we're going to see an upper on this shoe that's flying it or adding it like what's on the Vaporfly 3 or the Alphafly 2. I do think this upper is going to share a lot more in common with maybe what Nike's doing with their track shoe program. So overall, I think the Streakfly 2 will definitely have a cleaner, tighter fitting upper, and they'll just clean up a lot of the fit issues in the upper. And like I said, if that's all we get for the Streakfly 2, I'll be perfectly happy with that. But let's talk about the next two areas that Nike could really evolve the shoe from. And that's really the midsole and the outsole. So let's move to the midsole now. The thing about this midsole is I think it's kind of magical. I don't really want it to change, but I know a lot of people expected this shoe to be a little less flexible and have more propulsion forward. But I think Nike's been very deliberate with what this shoe is. Now, if you've ever read the book Kixology, and if you've not read it, I would highly recommend it. There's a chapter in there that talks a lot about the Vaporfly 4% development, particularly the later stages of it around release, so around 2016-17. And there's a section in there where the author talks about how Nike tested 50 plus different prototypes of what ultimately became the Vaporfly 4%. And they tested them with a carbon plate in them and a lot without a carbon plate. Now, we know what happened with the 4%. We know what happened with the Super Share. We know about the Nike carbon plate. But there's a lot of talk in that book around how the Nike athletes like the high stack of foam, or they didn't necessarily have to have the carbon plate. But Nike chose to develop the plate. And again, we know where that went. The author also says that Nike didn't totally abandon, the plateless Vaporfly. It just became the Pegasus Turbo. Now, I don't necessarily believe that because the Turbo didn't ever really feel like a Vaporfly for me. But if that is true, that makes my argument that this actually is a Turbo 3 even more strong. And I have a video about that as well. So card on the screen, link in the description. Now, if you think about it, and you compare this to the Vaporfly 4%, this shoe has geometry that's very similar to that. It doesn't have the extreme toe rocker that we see in a lot of shoes now. The stack height in this shoe is actually very similar to the Vaporfly 4%. In fact, there's a little bit more foam in the heel and a little bit more foam in the forefoot. But this shoe shares a lot more in common with the Vaporfly 4% than it did the next percent. And it actually, geometry-wise, is very similar to the Turbo. So what could Nike do here to evolve this midsole? The first one, I think, would be to put a plate in it. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't know. I don't work for Nike, but I just think it's unlikely. I think Nike's being very conscious not to put a plate in this shoe. But if they did, I don't think it would be a carbon plate. I think you'd see a PVEX plate, a nylon plate. Maybe it wouldn't even be a full plate. Maybe it's just a plate in the forefoot or something that goes in the midfoot. I think they could play with that and, bring some propulsion to the shoe while keeping the softness and the flexibleness of the shoe. We'll see. But I feel like Nike's probably already tested and worked through some of that stuff, and there's a reason why it wasn't in the first version. So I don't think that is necessarily that likely. The second way I think they could add some propulsion to this shoe would be to put a beefier strobel board in this shoe. Now, this shoe does already have a strobel board in it, or it has something above the Zoom X midsole, because there is an insole in here, there's some foam, and then there's another layer, and then you get the Zoom X. They could beef that up and make the shoe a little bit more rigid this way to give it a little bit more pop, but they wouldn't sacrifice any of the softness that a lot of us love about this shoe. I actually think this is one of the more likely things they're going to do with this shoe. Another thing they could actually do is they could go back to a sort of mix of foams, a lot like what they did in the Turbo series, where you have Zoom X on the top, and then in the Turbo you had React on the bottom, so a carrier layer of foam. I don't know if that's going to happen, and if it does, I don't know if it would be React, because Nike has a bunch of different versions of foams now. There's a Cushion 2.0 coming out this year. There's the new React X foam that we're seeing on the Infinity Run 4. No one really knows what that foam is. So Nike could sandwich another foam, or they could put Zoom X in the middle of this and then put a carrier foam around it, a lot like they did in the Zoom Fly. I think there's a lot of options there, but I think they're unlikely. I think Nike, because this is a fly shoe, this is a race shoe, they want to keep it all Zoom X. That is their current race foam, and that is sort of their key technology. So I think they're going to keep it that way. But we could see a couple, maybe 2 layers of different durometers of Zoom X. I don't know. I think they could do sandwiches or different layers of foam in this shoe to give it more propulsion forward. And I think that is something we may see. The last thing is really around the outsole. So I love this outsole. This is Nike, what Nike called the generative outsole. It was really a lot of computational development to create these ridges to grip the best and create these valleys to flex the best for the most amount of runners. We first saw it on the Alpha Fly, we saw it on the Tempo after that, and then we saw it on this shoe. But this is probably the shoe that it makes the most sense on, because this shoe is actually flexible and you can get the benefit of that. But this is now at least a 3 to 4 year old piece of technology for Nike, and the design language of this outsole is quite old now. So I do think we're going to update this. I do think we're going to see a new outsole in the shoe. So if they update the outsole in the shoe, that could also add some stiffness to it, adding more rubber in this area, maybe pulling the rubber back in, maybe doing something that wraps around like a horseshoe. There's a lot they could do with the rubber in the outsole to add a little bit more stiffness or support to this shoe and maybe a little bit more pop. The problem with a lot of that is it will make the shoe very bottom heavy. I don't think you necessarily really want that in a Streakfly because this is such a lightweight shoe and you will really feel that. But I do think we're going to see a different outsole in here. I hope it's something more like what's on the Vaporfly 3, the waffle that's got very square edges in the forefoot so the shoe doesn't rock as much back and forth. Something like a waffle outsole would make a lot of sense on a Streakfly because again, that waffle really has a lot of versatility to it, has a lot of good ground feel to it, and it'll work for everywhere that athletes are using the shoe for. So I think that is something we're also going to see on the Streakfly 2 eventually. Let me know what you think about the Streakfly, what you want to see in the Streakfly moving forward. I'm always curious about all those comments. If you're new here, subscribe. You'll see more content like this pop up in your feed. If you've been around here for a while, drop a like on this video. It helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.